In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Cor Maria Immaculatum.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Iosef.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Pierecime.
Ora pro nobis.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. The Sacred Liturgy. Okay, we left off with the modernists arguing, well, the early church did it. The early church did it, so the early church said Mass on a table, so we can. The early church gave communion in the hand, so we can. But they only did that because they were in the catacombs. And someone had to bring Holy Communion to the other Catholics in other catacombs. So, let's see where we left off here. So we're talking about active participation. Let's just take it from in ancient times, Michael.
Liturgists have hastily jumped to the conclusion that the Pope wanted the Church to return to the practice of the early Christians, who had included some congregational singing in the liturgy. Where did they get that impression? Certainly not from the Latin version of the motu proprio, which mentions nothing about ancient times. The impression arose from the vernacular texts regarding a misunderstanding of the Latin phrase more meorum, as used by Pope Pius X in paragraph 3, with reference to Gregorian chant. The Italian version uses the ambiguous expression anticamente, which could mean either in antiquity or simply formerly. The English version, ignoring the second meaning, states that Gregorian chant used to be the custom in some unspecified ancient times, but neither comes near to an accurate translation of more meorum. We need to know the relevance of this particular phrase and why it was chosen as being most appropriate. The mos meorum custom of the ancestors was the unwritten code of traditional values observed by the ancient Romans and incorporated into their laws. It represented their time-honored cultural and social practices and provided guidelines for private, political, and military life in Roman times.
Okay, footnote, Virgil's Aeneid celebrates the mos maiorum of the Roman people as depicted in the character of Aeneas. He epitomized the Roman ideal of pietas, the core concept of ancient Roman morality, which included duties to religion, the family, the wider community, and the patria, the homeland.
Just as adherence to tradition gave the Romans a sense of what was fitting and proper, the same could be said for the suitability of Gregorian chant, which had a long and venerable tradition in the Church. The mos maiorum was the medium of transmission of Gregorian chant, as the Pope explained. It had been handed down by tradition, quem transmissit traditio,
which tradition handed down.
Now, we can see clearly why it should be restored to the people, so that through its special power to move the soul, they can once again participate in the liturgy, more maiorum, in the custom of previous generations of Catholics, before the fashion for theatrical and profane music had invaded the churches.
Yeah, so many hymns with theatrical notes jumping from do's to t's, and then profane music with profaned melodies started to enter the church. So this is what Pius X wanted to clean up and go back to the primitive Gregorian chant, the beauty of the simplicity of the Gregorian chant. Go.
There is thus no reference to or recommendation of congregational singing, which, if took place at some times and in some places, was never established and universal custom of the Roman Rite. So it could not have been designated as part of the Mos Maiorum. We can be sure that the translation in ancient times is false for two reasons. First, because More Maiorum refers to an ongoing, unbroken tradition. And secondly, because customs that have been discarded for centuries cannot be reincorporated into the liturgy without destroying its intrinsically traditional nature. Indeed, any attempt to do so was later condemned as antiquarianism by Pope Pius XII in Mediator Dei.
Okay. Yeah, antiquarianism. So that's the modernist argument. The early church did it, so we have to do it now, right? The early church had to use whatever they could for a chalice, so we have to go back to glass or pottery chalices. That's just false. And it's part of the rubric. I don't know when it would have been done, but early in the church history, the inside of the chalice has to be gilded gold. And then the paten, at least the top part, has to be gold, the most precious metal on earth. The bottom can be silver. The outside of the chalice can be silver or some other precious metal, but it has to be gold on the inside. So, all right, the spirit of novelty, Anthony.
Anyone who pauses to reflect on the implications of this anomaly can see what is amiss. In any translation, an exact conformity is required to carry over, which is the meaning of translate. The same ideas from one language to another. But in the case of TLS and its further translation into other vernacular languages, some interested party has obviously had a powerful influence in the choice of phrases which promote the agenda of the reformers. This independent spirit is strikingly evident at those key points where TLS and other vernacular versions diverge from the Latin text. These can be summed up as follows. 1. A call to adopt the liturgical practices of the early church. The suggestion that
Next point.
2. The suggestion that vocalization by the laity is the litmus test of their true participation in the liturgy.
So this totally ignores what participation? This puts all emphasis on the
Active participation.
well, external. Because internal participation is active too. That's how ambiguous that term is, right? So the modernists say vocalization, being loud in the Mass, is participation. But there's an interior participation, which is more important. Next point.
A shift in emphasis towards the quote-unquote common priesthood of the baptized and away from the sacramental priesthood of the priest, who alone offers the Mass in an official capacity for the living and the dead.
Next point.
An implied criticism of silent participation by the laity, who may be saying private prayers during Mass.
Yes, so criticizing those who are not clapping their hands and shouting and screaming, or at least responding. As to which
of these points Pope Pius X subscribed to, the answer is none of the above.
The laity as listeners, not singers. Guadalupe.
There is simply no convincing evidence in his motu proprio that Pius X intended the congregation to participate by singing Gregorian chant, for he stated that, quote, singers in church have a real liturgical office, end quote. Therefore, he designated the clergy and the all-male choir as the sole legitimate executants of Gregorian chant. We may infer that the congregation was, by definition, not included in this form of participation. It is clear then that Pius X regarded the laity as listeners, not singers. This is reinforced in another part of the same document, where where he mentioned two distinct categories of participants in the liturgy: those who sing, the clergy and the choir, and those for whose spiritual benefit the singing is undertaken, the rest of the faithful. This makes perfect sense only in terms of traditional Catholic worship, as it is the clergy who communicate the divine to the faithful by the performance of the rites. Of course, there have always been times when at least some members of the congregation would sing during the liturgy, either spontaneously or because they felt compelled to do so under duress from their priests. But there are simply no grounds for believing that Pius X acknowledged a right and a duty for the congregation to perform the singing along with the clergy and the choir. In paragraph 2 of the General Principles, Pius X refers to the holiness of Gregorian chant and the, quote, manner in which it is presented by those who execute it, end quote. Then he mentioned the efficacy of such music in touching the hearts and minds of those who listen to it. In animis audientium illam. However, a condition applies. In order to produce the desired effect of helping the soul to attain deeper levels of contemplation of the divine mysteries, the singing must, semper optime cantatur, be always sung to the highest standards, and the voices competently trained for that purpose. That is why Pius X called for scholae cantorum to be established in the seminaries and religious institutions for the execution of sacred polyphony and of good liturgical music, paragraph 25. And also at parochial level, quote, even in smaller churches and country parishes, end quote, paragraph 27. At no point in the document did the Pope give instructions, as his successors would do, for the performance of congregational singing.
The logic of true participation, but the traditional Roman rite, which had withstood the test of time and was fine-tuned to be quintessentially Catholic, had a logic of its own which was understood, alas, this is no longer the case, by all practicing Catholics, no matter what century they lived in. St. Thomas More explained it thus, quote, good folk find this indeed, that when they be at the divine service in the church, the more devoutly that they see such godly ceremonies observed, and the more solemnity that they see therein, the more devotion feel they themselves therewith in their own souls. So that's St. Thomas More, the confutation of Tyndale's answer. So he's not stressing on congregational singing or responding. He's talking about the inward devotion is increased. That was precisely the logic of Pius X's motu proprio. In the introduction, the Pope singled out from among his many concerns the one that was of the greatest importance. Footnote, the English mistranslation refers to this concern as a leading one, implying that there were others of the same ranking, such as active participation, but Pius X had left no room for equivocation. Illa principem tenet locum. That one holds the highest place. Emphasis on illa, or that one. Back to the text. In the introduction, the Pope singled out from among his many concerns the one that was of the greatest importance, which was to promote the decorum of the house of God and the solemnity and splendor of the ceremonies. Therefore, he said, nothing should take place that would disturb or diminish the prayer and piety of the faithful, who participated by drawing spiritual sustenance from the actions of the priest and his ministers in the sanctuary. This was the reality of lay participation experienced by countless Catholics for centuries, before the liturgical movement discredited the practice and reviled the faithful as quote-unquote silent spectators. So that was a term they often used to knock the silent faithful in the pews and to start being more active loudly. But as far as the liturgical reformers were concerned, the question of fidelity to tradition was academic. Neither ethics nor truth was required, simply the strong arm of the law to impose an ongoing revolution. Yes, so this shows the importance of the ceremonies, that they be done well. The MC knows what he's doing. It's up to the MC to correct ever so discreetly what goes on in the altar and what goes on in the sanctuary. Sometimes not so discreetly. So if let's say MC2 is supposed to be out the other side for picking up the missal during the incensation at the offertory, for example, and you're trying to eye the MC2, right? And he's...
AC2.
Oh yeah, AC2, sorry, acolyte 2. You're trying to eye him, hey, get over there, and he's not responding, and he's in ecstasy. You can do something like, the MC can do that. Only the MC, because that's his job. And if that still doesn't work, you have to go over to him and say, you forgot to move the missal. Get over there, right? So the importance of the beautiful ceremonies, and this is what Pius X, just as the ceremonies should be pristine, flawless, done reverently, devotedly, so the chant should be. And he's not saying the laity have to be doing this. It's to train schola. Because Gregorian chant is difficult. It's some difficult pieces, as you know. A question of logic, Michael.
To illustrate the point, we will make use of the medieval adage ex falso quod libet. From a falsehood, anything follows. Meaning that once a contradiction is admitted as truth, any conclusion, however nonsensical, can logically be derived from it. When applied to Novus Ordo liturgy, this principle explains the logical underpinnings of the regime of novelty.
Okay, here's a footnote. As an insight, we can see how this worked in practice as a direct result of the false principles opening to the world, ecumenism, etc., introduced by Vatican II, in contradiction to the Church's tradition. The ensuing toll of destruction speaks for itself. Go on.
Once active participation is accepted as an authentic and indispensable method of lay involvement in the liturgy, any activity, no matter how inappropriate, sacrilegious, or offensive to morals, flows logically from the false premise. Even though the logic of the liturgical reforms makes sense within its own terms of references, its starting point, quote-unquote active participation, was wrong. So, its conclusions, the practical consequences as evidenced in the Novus Ordo Mass, were also wrong, in spite of the correctness of its logic, or rather, because of it. The truth of this adage was demonstrated by St. Thomas More in the 16th century in one of his polemical treatises against the Protestant reformers, who had rejected the doctrine of the real presence and changed their liturgies to suit. When William Tyndale mocked some of the Church's traditional rituals as superstitious practices, More replied that anyone capable of deriding the way devout Catholics worshipped over the centuries is also likely to disdain the Eucharist itself. This principle also explains why so many churchmen see nothing at all amiss with the routine irreverence displayed during the liturgy, especially to the Eucharistic presence, and do not see the most outrageous examples of profanation, even though they hit you right in the eye. These are the inevitable outcomes of the all-encompassing directive of Vatican II's Liturgy Constitution, which makes quote-unquote active participation the primary consideration of the liturgy. Those who enact it are, after all, only obeying the logic of the reforms and are convinced they are perfectly correct. Thus, the root of the present crisis in the liturgy can be traced to that single word, active, found in the vernacular version of the motu proprio reiterated in subsequent magisterial documents. Because it stood in contradiction to tradition. In fact, it was expressly intended by the reformers to stamp out the contemplative and devotional dimension of worship, which provided a sense of reverence and awe. It had the effect of causing the entire logical framework of the lex orandi to explode. This is only to be expected, as the adage expulso quod libet is also called, the principle of explosion. Providentially, there is no such tripwire in the Latin motu proprio of Pius X.
Yes. So St. Pius X, he doesn't speak about the laymen singing or joining in. It's a trained schola of men, and usually they're clerics who are singing. So what was the buzzword to kick off the revolution?
Active participation.
Yeah, active participation. Enter Dom Lambert Baudouin. This should be interesting. Anthony?
After the fateful and entirely inappropriate expression, active participation, appeared out of the blue in 1903, it got a muted reception. Few people, unless they had a goal to score, knew what to make of it or what to do with it. The first person to pick up the ball and run with it was the Benedictine monk Dom Lambert Baudouin, 1873 to 1960, a monk of the monastery of Mont César in Louvain, Belgium. His goal was both ecumenical and secular, to promote the, quote, universal priesthood of all believers, end quote, through participatory liturgy, and unite them in a common program of social reform and pan-Christian unity. It was not for nothing that Baudouin is regarded as a pioneer of the liturgical as well as the ecumenical movement and a quote-unquote prophet of the Second Vatican Council. His influence on the direction of Vatican II was far wider and deeper than is generally known. He actively anticipated by half a century the most important progressive positions of Vatican II in the key areas of liturgy, ecumenism, and ecclesiology. His confrere, Dom Olivier Rousseau, Dom Olivier Rousseau, remarked, quote, "Today, the fruits of his efforts can be discerned in nearly every movement which has marked the Church in this 20th century. The three most important doctrinal advances of Vatican II were in the areas of liturgy, ecumenism, and ecclesiology. Thus, Baudouin was one of the great forerunners of Vatican II in its three key areas," end quote. In 1925, Baudouin founded a monastery at Aimé-sur-Meuse, later moved to Chevatogne for ecumenical purposes. Both Mont César and Aimé were to become, under Baudouin's influence, the nexus of strategic planning for various projects, promoting active participation among the laity, adapting the liturgy to contemporary needs, linking it to social activism, reorienting monastic life towards the world outside the cloister, and fostering ecumenism among different religious denominations without seeking conversion to Catholicism. Looking back now from the vantage point of our own times, we can see how Vatican II, under the heading of the New Evangelization, mirrored and brought to fruition Baudouin's pioneering efforts in all these areas.
Okay, so Baudouin, 1925, this is early, right? They're doing ecumenical experimentation. They're getting emphasis on the active participation, ecumenism with false religions. This is all Sion movement stuff, right? And as we're going to see, Baudouin was connected to the Sion. The barbarian in the citadel, loud and clear. Lupe? Baudouin.
Baudouin's decision to become a monk of the monastery of Mont César in 1906 was critical for the development of the liturgical movement. Within the protection of its walls, he was able to exploit the monastery's financial resources to launch the liturgical movement in a way that was not possible for a simple parish priest. He had at his disposal a willing cohort of monks to prepare his publications, which he disseminated by means of the monastery's printing press, and he hosted liturgical weeks and retreats in the monastery's accommodation. From the beginning of his clerical career, Baudouin revealed a deep alienation from the values and spirituality of traditional Catholicism as manifested in the liturgy of the Roman Rite. Even in his seminary days, he rebelled against the regime which, he claimed, taught nothing about the liturgy except courses on rubrics. These he dismissed derisively as a, quote, series of minutely detailed and arbitrary rules imposed, it would seem, to try the patience of those who study them and put them into practice, end quote. As for the traditional missal, it was for him un livre ferme et scellé, a closed and sealed book. He considered the liturgical books in general to be no more than des grimoire, mumbo-jumbo, incantations and magical formulae. He also admitted that he had never recited his breviary with the least devotion or interest. Well, we should not, however, take these self-deprecatory statements at face value. It is more likely that they were meant as an oblique criticism of traditional methods of priestly formation of which he was the supposed victim. These he dismissed as being totally ineffective for fostering the spiritual life, describing them as hidebound by archaic structures and rigid disciplinary rules. He was not, however, willing to concede that the same seminaries were producing numerous educated and holy men in the priesthood who were devoted to the Mass and the sacraments, and who were equipped with the necessary knowledge for the discharge of their ministry. And, to cap it all, he pursued a campaign of increasing hostility to Catholic devotions, such as visits to the Blessed Sacrament, a staple of all seminary training. It is clear that as a priest, Baudouin had not benefited from, because he rejected, a formation in piety and discipline, nor had he imbibed any love or respect for traditional Catholic theology as taught in the seminaries. For him, such studies were too abstract and precise, too mathematical. He compared them to a theorem in geometry or algebra. Instead, he leaned towards independence of belief on doctrinal matters, and developed a theology of the Mass that bore a distinct resemblance to Protestantism. Records exist and have been published by sympathetic biographers, not only of his printed works, but also of his private correspondence, illustrating this point. Thus we find that Baudouin entertained notions which indicate a concordance of belief with Protestant critics of the Catholic liturgy. These were, briefly, that the Mass should be called the Lord's Supper. The Mass is a quote-unquote meal, celebrated around a family table. A communitarian aspect of the Eucharist should be promoted in order to build up social communities. The people should ratify the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and so on in like manner. These few examples reveal quite a considerable degree of alienation from the Catholic doctrine of the Mass. Yet astoundingly, they became the building blocks of the Novus Ordo Missae, introduced by Pope Paul VI in 1969, and can be found in the general instruction of the Roman Missal. By reiterating Baudouin's proposals for liturgical reform, the Pope officially accepted a Protestant heritage within the Catholic Church. Of special concern is Baudouin's attitude to the reserved Blessed Sacrament, which would later exert influence on the placement of the tabernacle in Catholic churches. This aspect of his Eucharistic theology was not commonly known because he only expressed it unambiguously in his private correspondence or during the retreats he organized for priests. But as a result of archival research, some of his letters have been located and their content published at the beginning of the 21st century, revealing Baudouin's rejection of Catholic theology. These original sources contain many surprises, not to mention shocks, for those who regarded Baudouin as a credible Catholic theologian. As part of his campaign to discredit the pious custom of visiting the Blessed Sacrament, he wrote that, first point, adoration of the reserved sacrament is not of divine institution. Christ did not say, adore this in memory of me outside the action of the Mass.
So downplaying that intimate and close visits to the Blessed Sacrament. That's surprising coming from a monk. So this is a typical modernist. Next point.
Those who adore the Blessed Sacrament outside the Mass have given substance to individual piety to the detriment of the collective unity of the Eucharist.
Right, and on the footnote you have all these in French. Next point.
This worship of the God of the tabernacle is a true heresy.
That's Baudouin. Well, he is God who dwells in the tabernacle. So you see the modernism here? Really entrenched already, early 1900s. Last 2 points.
Our Lord might be infinitely adorable, but he did not come to be adored, but to adore the Father with us and for us.
And last.
The faithful adore the Blessed Sacrament because it has to be reserved as viaticum, but it is not reserved so that they must adore it.
Yes.
If we examine closely each of these statements, it will become apparent that they are all
fallacious
and simply illustrate Baudouin's mastery of the art of paltering, creating a false impression through the intentional choice of words. By leaving such words open to interpretation and encasing them in convoluted sentences, riddles, and irrelevant information, he succeeded in casting doubt on the divinity of Christ and causing confusion in the minds of the faithful.
Yes. And what was his main tool to cause confusion in the minds of the faithful?
Ambiguous words.
Ambiguous words, double meaning phrases, convoluted sentences, convoluted riddles, and irrelevant information. Sounds like the Vatican II documents. Baudouin's political background. Now this is very interesting because we're right in the middle of studying the Pius X. What's the document called?
Our Apostolic Mandate.
What year did he write it?
1910.
Who did he condemn?
The Seals.
Sion, which is the seed of a lot of modernism. The end of the 19th century was critical for social power struggles in Belgium, not only between Flemish and Walloon nationalists, but between workers and employers. It is a matter of historical record that Baudouin, like many priests of his time, had been involved in trade unionism and class-oriented politics. Footnote: with the introduction of universal male suffrage in 1894, some Catholic priests, like Baudouin's mentor, Father Antoine Potier in Liège, involved themselves in mass politics and tried to recruit the support of the newly enfranchised workers in the class struggle. So, priests being too heavily involved in the politics. He spent his days in the seminary at Liège under the tutelage of the professor of moral theology, Father Antoine Potier, who, as the local leader of the Christian Democrat movement, what does that sound like? Christian Democrat movement was a political firebrand kindling workers' demonstrations and strikes. He caused a scandal by calling on workers to reject authority structures and form their own unions without the involvement of their employers. In fact, Father Potier's militant pro-worker activities, coupled with his antagonism against employers in Liège, caused Pope Leo XIII to intervene personally in 1895 and require him to give up his social and political activism for the sake of peace and harmony. Footnote: it is also clear that Father Potier adhered to the socialist view that workers had a right to an equal share in the profits made by their employers, and that wages should be set up by the state. So that's pure socialism, this priest. He's involved, pushing socialism. Soon after his ordination in 1897, Baudouin joined the Congregation des Aumôniers du Travail, the Congregation of Industrial Chaplains, a society of worker priests. So that's where it all began in France and Belgium. Worker priests. The priest throws off his cassock, goes works in the labor field, which had been established by the Bishop of Liège, Monsignor Victor de Troilloux. He then spent 7 years living among the workers in the footsteps of Father Potier after the latter's enforced retirement from political agitation. So Pope Leo XIII slapped Father Potier on the hand and said, "Get back to being a priest." It is not surprising that Father Baudouin's radicalized past was heavily implicated in his vision of the liturgy. We are assured this was so by one of the Baudouin's principal biographers, who stated, quote, his background as a labor chaplain had a tremendous influence upon his liturgical interest. So you can see this Christian democratic movement was already tied in with the Sion, right? And it was the Sion was condemned. All these ideas were condemned by Pius X. And this is earlier than Pius X, so we're right on the edge of his pontificate. The liturgy politicized, Michael.
Just as he saw society in terms of a conflict between the rich and the poor, industrialists and workers, he saw a counterpart in the constitution of the church, whose clergy, whom he dubbed the aristocracy, were allegedly guilty of depriving the ordinary faithful of the means to draw spiritual subsistence from the liturgy.
Yes, so the clergy were like the upper class, depriving the faithful of sustenance from the liturgy. So they're doing all the prayers, they're leading everything, they're in the sanctuary. Something has to be done about this to bring about equality. And what's it going to be? Take a guess.
Liturgical reform.
And involving what in the sanctuary?
People, laity.
Laity in the sanctuary, saying the prayers. After all, it's the aristocratic priests who hold the monopoly on all this. It's just foolishness. Go on.
In his inaugural speech made at the Congress of Malines, Belgium, in 1909, Baudouin started the liturgical movement on this footing. Quote, "Every child of the church is a saint in the making. Therefore, the liturgy is not the exclusive preserve of an ascetic aristocracy and placed out of reach of the ordinary Christians," end quote.
Okay, so he sees the clergy as this upper class. Really stupid. When Christ instituted the clergy. Go on.
He repeated the same theme at the inauguration of the Centre de Pastorale Liturgique.
The center of liturgical pastoral activities.
In 1945.
What year was that?
1945.
Go on.
When he stated that the liturgy was not only for an elite, nonsense cement,
That's
une
French.
elite,
Not only for the elite. Go on.
but for all the faithful, all the people of God.
Footnote, Louis Boyer. So there's our friend Louis Boyer again. Go on.
Talking as if there were grounds for the people to feel aggrieved for being quote-unquote excluded by the clergy. The innuendo, which was characteristic of Baudouin's polemics against the traditional liturgy, is revealing. It shows that the priest's role was a major issue for the liturgical reforms and was being used to invoke a sense of injustice among the faithful where none existed before.
Okay, we'll pick up there. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.